First of all, we would like to thank the board of the Captiva Island Historical Society for the opportunity to give a presentation here in Captiva Island, where my distant relative Raymond Halsey used to live around 90 years ago. After my short introduction, Gabri will tell you about the incredible life of Raymond Halsey, or as we pronounce it, Raymond Holzhey. But first I want to introduce us to you. We are Gabri and Tanja, a married couple, both historians living in Amsterdam, the Netherlands. My roots, however, are just like Raymond's roots in the middle of Germany, in Thuringia, where most of my family still lives now. It is quite a coincidence that we are here on Captiva Island. Until a few years ago, we didn't know there was a connection between us and this lovely little island here. In October 2012, I came across an old newspaper article about Raymond Halsey. Here you can see a piece of it on this picture. This was the beginning of an incredible discovery that took us back to the 19th century United States. It led us to different archives in the middle of Germany, the region where Raymond was born, to Bremerhaven in the north of Germany, the port from which Raymond traveled to the United States, to Wisconsin, where Raymond spent his first years in the United States and where he committed his first robberies, up to the Upper Peninsula in Michigan, where he even killed a man and was imprisoned, all the way down to Captiva Island, where Raymond spent the rest of his life as a decent man. But how did this discovery start? As I said, it was a great coincidence. About 7 years ago, Gabri told me about one of his relatives having emigrated to the US. This great uncle of his father was converted to Mormonism and had moved from Holland to Salt Lake City in the early 20th century. His story reminded me of a story I heard as a child. Somebody had told me about a family member who had emigrated to the United States. I was really interested in this person, since this was the time of the Cold War and I grew up on the other side of the Iron Curtain, in East Germany. The US felt to me as far away as Mars. But unfortunately, there was nothing else known about this relative who went to the US. And strangely enough, years later, nobody of my family remembered anything about an immigrant to the United States anymore. When Gabri told me about this great uncle in Salt Lake City, I remembered the mysterious immigrant of our family. It crossed my mind that my relative might have become a Mormon too. So one night it just combined two names in Google. My family, Halsey, which is not a common name fortunately, and Salt Lake City. One of the first search results was this newspaper article. It reported the capture of the notorious stagecoach robber Raymond Halsey. This Google search changed my evening, took us around the world and finally brought us here. Immediately fascinated by this guy with the same uncommon family name, I continued my search on the internet that night. I discovered more and more newspaper articles about him and got more and more excited, and it got later and later that evening. On the internet, I eventually came across a book where I was able to view the first page. At the end of that first page, the author, Bruce Cox, gave the birthplace of Raymond, which appeared to be the same small village where my father and his family came from, and where I spent my holidays as a child. Given the location, it was quite clear Raymond must have been the forgotten family member. Finally, I went to bed at 4 o'clock in the morning that night. I ordered the small book on Raymond, which is, by the way, still for sale. Here you can see the cover of it. First, I planned to translate the book into German, but over the time I came across a lot of new information, sources and contexts, which made a more detailed book possible. Gabri joined the team and we continued the search together, but Gabri is writing the book. In 2014, Gabri and I went to Michigan and Wisconsin, where Raymond committed his crimes. On the upper peninsula of Michigan, we met the local historians Bruce Cox and Arlene Schneller, who had done research on Raymond's story. They showed us a lot of historical places and material. For example, the so-called Holzhey Hill, on Stagecoach Road, the place where Raymond committed his last and most terrible robbery. Here on the picture, you can see a little impression of the Stagecoach Road. Arlene Schneller and Bruce Cox took us to the courthouse, even to the courtroom where Raymond was convicted, and they showed us the prison where he was imprisoned, but only from the outside since it is still a prison, so we couldn't go inside. And now we are here to tell you about the incredible life of Raymond Halsey. Gabri's presentation will be a short summary of our book, which will be published in January 2021. It will be published in Dutch, but we hope for translations into German and English. By now, Gabri has written 7 of the 8 chapters of our book, so in a while you might be able to read the more detailed version of this incredible story Gabri is telling you now. Thank you very much.
Yes, ladies and gentlemen, also from me, thank you very much for the invitation and for the opportunity to come and tell the story of Raymond Halsey, who died here on the island now 68 years ago. And we first take a look at his death certificate. And from that, we can learn that he was single at the moment he died. He was an author of short stories. The names of his father and mother were unknown, and he lived for 22 years on Captiva Island. But, of course, most of his biography remains unmentioned, which didn't mean, by the way, that his passing away stayed unnoticed. The Fort Myers News Press wrote about his death, saying, "Aged Sanibel writer killed self on porch." You see the newspaper article here. And the newspaper report stated that he had left a note with his place and death of birth, saying Rheinschütz, Sachsen-Meiningen, Germany, October 2nd, 1866. There it is. We will turn to this Rheinschütz in a moment, but first we'll take a look at how Raymond was remembered here on the island. Because thanks to the work of the CIHS, we have some beautiful audio fragments of witnesses who recalled the last years of Raymond Halsey. And also the Island Reporter published in November 1976 a beautiful story on Raymond's secrets. Joe Whiteman, well known here on the island of course, remembered Raymond in 1976 as, he said, the finest kind of a guy. He only talked about Germany once, and that was 4 days before he committed suicide. He told me he came to America to avoid a draft. End of citation. But why Raymond came to Captiva, Whiteman could not tell. Bill Shannon, 63 years of age, an owner of the Sunshine restaurant, remembered that someone told him that Raymond worked for some club up in northern Michigan or Canada, maybe as a trapper or a guide. Halsey had a dinner at Bill Shannon's restaurant a few times, and Shannon remembered that Raymond had, as he said, only a thumb on his right hand and no fingers. Raymond was said to be a writer and also an avid reader. He was very self-sufficient, someone who didn't want to burden anyone. He dressed in rough clothes, blue denim mostly, wore an old felt hat and was always smoking a pipe. He had a thin face and a little moustache and big ears. He was difficult to understand because he spoke very broken English, so you had to talk to him a long time before you could understand exactly what he was saying. Most islanders knew him as a solitary, reclusive man who was getting by on some kind of pension, someone said. He had a canoe with a sail on it, with which he made long trips. One Captivian, who in 1976 preferred to remain nameless, said he once heard a rumor that Halsey spent some time in jail, maybe even killed a man. But further information is sparse, and most of his life is left untold. So who was this man from Rheinschütz? What kind of secret did he conceal? And why didn't he talk about where he came from? And why were 4 fingers of his right hand missing? Raymond was born 86 years earlier in central Germany in the year 1866. The village of Rheinschütz should be read as Remschütz, a very small village in Thuringia in the former German Democratic Republic. And there it is on the map. Remschütz still exists. It has less than 400 inhabitants and it looks exactly how you imagine a small idyllic German village. You see it here with timbered buildings, a small river and a mountain. And this was the view Raymond had when he was a kid. The first years of his life he probably never went further than a few kilometers from his village. Common people like his folks, they didn't go far. His father was a peasant, working on the land each day. His mother cared for the children. And here, on the next slide, we see the house he grew up in. It still exists, with the dwellings on the right, stables on the left, and a courtyard in the middle. He must have played here, learned how to walk, do things children all over the world do, chasing the chickens. 2 weeks after he was born, he was baptized in the close-by Lutheran church in the villa of Gabri, which was very idyllic too. And there's something interesting in the church archive of Gabri we found. You see here the church archive. It's very hard to read it, so don't try this at home, but we managed. His maternal uncle Oscar Schwartz was his godfather, and this Oscar was to play an important role in Raymond's life. Because 3 years after Raymond was baptized, Oscar emigrated to America, which, by the way, was a pretty common thing to do for Germans in those years. For ordinary people like Raymond's family, there was not much of a future in Germany. The small duchy of Saxon-Meiningen, to which Remschütz belonged, was one of the many administrative entities in that time. A united Germany did not yet exist, and there were dozens of small states, like you can see here on this map, all independent and competing with each other. There were conflicts, wars, crop failures, problems with water management, and a chronic lack of coordination and much bureaucracy. Even if you wanted to settle in a nearby duchy, you had to apply for a permit. Citizens were not free. Chances for a farmer's son like Raymond was slim. There was too little land to cultivate. The infrastructure was very poor. Cities grew explosively, but still there was a lot of unemployment. Economic development and industrial development was slow, and there was a huge social inequality, class anxiety, and food problems. All these elements led to massive immigration in the 19th century, also in the family of Raymond. In 1869, Raymond's godfather Oscar was not the first to emigrate to the US. Raymond's uncle Christian Schwartz, the elder brother of Oscar, had already gone to America in 1852. We suppose Christian and Oscar have written letters to their sister Eileen, Raymond's mother. They must have told her that in America there was much less social inequality, no unemployment, no food problems. Of course, you had to work hard as an immigrant, but that was rewarded by society. Uncle Christian and Uncle Oscar built a nice company and a good future in Wisconsin and Green Bay. These good experiences in America, the hopeless existence in Germany, and the prospect to get drafted in the Prussian army in the near future must have caused Raymond to emigrate as well. In 1882, he was 15 years old at that moment, he left. It must have been a huge adventure for 15-year-old Raymond. He took the train to the port of Bremerhaven in the north of Germany, where he saw the sea for the first time. From Bremerhaven, he took the steamship the Braunschweig, of which we are lucky to have this beautiful photograph, for a journey that lasted 14 days from 12th to 26th May 1882. This was not a pleasure journey. The ship was overcrowded. The voyage must have been a terrible experience for all emigrants. Despite the official number of 700 passengers for whom the ship was built, no less than 1,400 passengers landed on arrival in New York, of whom about 400 children were younger than 15. But after 2 weeks of harsh conditions on the ship, Raymond finally arrived in the US, in New York. Ellis Island didn't exist yet, so he arrived at Castle Garden. And although New York wasn't what it is now, the city must have made a crushing impression. Brooklyn Bridge, you see here, it was built right in the spring of 1882, the moment Raymond left the ship. It must have been directly clear to Raymond that he had arrived in a completely different country, where things were done much faster, bigger, and differently than in small-scale Germany. America was much more forward-looking, working on a large scale, and everyone was exploiting opportunities. But he didn't stay in New York. By train, he went to Green Bay in Wisconsin. As I said, Uncle Christian Schwartz owned a company, a successful carpentry business and a planing mill. Together with 2 companions, also Germans, he had about 15 people employed. With his business, he had been responsible for the construction of the Green Bay courthouse, which is caught in this photograph, which was really a nice commission for him with his new founded business to construct. We know little about Raymond's life in those years. What we know is that he lived with his family, did his work consciously, and he had good technical insight. He was said to be a quiet young man, went to the pub once in a while, didn't drink much, but used to read a lot. Working for his uncles seems not to have caused any problems. The first years he worked in the Swatch Company in Green Bay, and after 3 years he moved to the small village of Pulsifer, near Green Bay, to work in the mill of his godfather, Uncle Oscar. So all went well for a couple of years, and that's the reason there's hardly any information about Raymond in those years. Until 1888, 6 years after he arrived. Then Raymond went on a journey. He gave up his work and he left. We know he went to the far west, to the Washington Territories, to Oregon, the Puget Sound. He worked as a cowboy and he learned how to shoot. After 6 months, he was back in Pulsifer, but he no longer wanted to work for his uncles anymore. In winter, he worked in a lumber camp in the north of Wisconsin as a log scaler, but he didn't feel well. He complained that he slept badly, felt cut off from his feelings, and so he went to Chicago and to see a psychiatrist. And this is a remarkable step and an intelligent step for a young man who had problems, because he himself clearly understood that he needed help. But nevertheless, he increasingly lost his grip on his life, and in April 1889, he would commit a robbery, his first robbery, directly near Pulsifer, and that we can read in the newspapers. We see he shot a horse. This caused an enormous stir because it was a quiet, peaceful area where this kind of thing didn't happen, and more robberies were to follow. He robbed stagecoaches around Pulsifer on April the 6th. On May the 4th, 2 mailbags with, among other things, $80. On May the 24th, a mailbag, $19. And then he was called Black Bart for the first time. But things went from bad to worse. May 29th. Milwaukee and Northern Railway. He started to rob trains. The loot is said to have been $235 and a silver watch. In August again, Wisconsin Central Railway. Loot, some watches and cash. Newspapers, of course, started writing about it. Also the German newspapers in America. And Raymond, by that time, well, he was a wanted man, and a very high bounty was put in his head, $3,000. And compare this to a monthly wage of about $40 for a skilled worker. That really was a lot of money. Yet Raymond managed to avoid being caught. Because the ground got too hot under his feet, he moved his activities north. We can take a look on a map where we see where he headed to Gabri County, in the western part of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, where he committed his last crime. On the southern shore of Lake Gabri, there was the White House Resort. You could go fishing, hunting, do nothing. It was a popular destination for well-to-do bankers and lawyers from the Minneapolis and Chicago area, and also close to an area where copper and iron were mined. And you can imagine tired bankers and lawyers like to go there. It was a beautiful place. It still is. And one of the people who stayed here for 2 weeks in the second half of August 1889 was lawyer Dolph Flashbang from Belleville, Illinois, which is very close to St. Louis. On August the 26th, Dolph Flashbang left the White House Inn to go home. Together with some other passengers, he took the stagecoach to the nearby train station, where he would take the train back to Chicago. But he never arrived there. And now I'll quote from the book we were writing to give you an impression what has happened at that moment Dolph Flashbang went home. When Raymond Halsey emerged from the vegetation a few kilometers before the station that morning and pointed his pistols at the stagecoach, Flashbang began the last hours of his life. Holzhey demanded money, $500. Perhaps assuming his armed appearance made a huge impression, he counted on getting what he wanted. But the opposite happened. Donald McArcher, one of the bankers behind Flashbang in the stagecoach, pulled his revolver and tried to hit Raymond. What happened next would be fought over later. According to one lecturer, Raymond shot back. The moment Dolph Flashbang got up and shoot too. Dolph got 2 bullets in his hip. Raymond himself later stated that the bullets came from McArcher's gun, who had hit his fellow passenger in the tumult. However, the newspapers were convinced that Raymond was to blame, that he and no one else had shot Flashbang. Donald McArcher had also been hit. One bullet pierced his leg, the other one his jaw. While the frightened horses suddenly ran off and the coachman grabbed the reins to get him under control again, Dolph Flashbang fell off the wagon. He was left alone in the company of his attacker. Raymond took away the defenseless, frightened lawyer $37, a necklace, a ring, and a watch, and then disappeared into the wilderness, leaving Flashbang badly injured along the side of the road. And the road we can see here, it was warm, there were flies, there were mosquitoes. It was really a bad situation Flashbang was in. And I must say, this is one of the strangest episodes in Raymond's life. From a quiet young man who did his duty, had a job, drank a little, read a lot, he had turned into a cold-blooded murderer who shot, robbed, and abandoned his defenseless and bleeding victim. And as I said, it was hot, dusty. Flashbang was plagued by flies, and it took hours for help to arrive. But it was by then already too late. Poor Flashbang died the next morning in the hospital of Bessemer as a victim of a senseless robbery committed by Raymond, who in a few months had developed into the terror of Wisconsin and Michigan. And of course he should be stopped. A manhunt was set in motion by Sheriff Foley of Coquebec County, along with volunteers and bloodhounds, but it led to nothing. Raymond loved the wilderness. He was an experienced trapper and traveled through the dense forest to the east until he arrived in the small town of Republic. And here he thought he was safe. He had dinner, rented a room for the night, and he misreckoned. Newspapers all over the US had written about the cold-hearted robber, and everyone on the UP was on his guard. Raymond was recognized and got arrested by Sheriff John Gloat the next morning. The first thing Gloat did was get Raymond photographed. He was photographed several times, then questioned to determine whether he was indeed the wanted robber, and then transferred to Bessemer to be put in jail and tried there in the new courthouse. Newspapers throughout the states reported about Raymond's case. But after he had been taken into custody, the reporters had to have patience until the court took up his case, of course. And this trial started in November. But right from the first day, it was a problem to assemble a jury. The first 24 candidates were rejected by Raymond's lawyers. So the court was forced to summon new candidate jurors, 75 in total, who had to report to the courthouse already the next morning at 6 o'clock. Dozens and dozens of men were interrogated by the prosecutor and the defense, but only a few were accepted by both parties, too few to put together a 12-member jury. So the search had to continue. After the 75 who appeared on Tuesday, 200 men had to report to the courthouse on Wednesday. And when no jury could be formed on that day, Judge Williams decided on Thursday evening that another 500 men were summoned. On Tuesday, November 12th, the jury finally was complete and a process of several days followed. The prosecution and the defense pleaded. Witnesses were heard, and Raymond himself was also heard here in this courthouse. Raymond told about his origins, his immigrations to the US, and his work in Green Bay and Pulsifer. He also told how he had gone west in 1887 and that he had worked there and traveled around on his horse. He said he had been injured somewhere in the Washington Territory because his horse had fallen on him. He had been unconscious for some time before he had regained consciousness and continued on his way. In the period that followed, he had noticed how his health and mental state were deteriorating. He could not describe exactly what was happening to him, but it affected his whole system and especially his head. Usually, he said, he felt well, but since the accident he was overwhelmed by strange delusions, which sometimes lasted a day or even longer. And these delusions always came rather unexpectedly, and at such moments Raymond was a danger to himself and to others. He sometimes retreated into the woods at such moments to prevent him from hurting anyone, but not always. Raymond said that he could still remember the day that he was arrested, and also to whoever had done that, but he could not tell why he had robbed the stagecoach. The fact that he had robbed the coach was all he remembered. The robbery seemed to have had an effect on Raymond's brain. It brought him back to consciousness, he said, making him realize what he was doing. That's why he fled into the woods, to avoid being caught. He couldn't remember who had been in the stagecoach at Coquebec, couldn't confirm that it was Dolph Flashbang, nor could he identify Flashbang's watch and wallet. It seemed as if he had seen these things for the first time at the trial, when Prosecutor Howell brought the objects to the attention of the jury. His lawyers tried to show that Raymond was insane at the moment he committed his crimes, but the jury could not be convinced. The jury was unanimous. Raymond was guilty. And Judge William D. Williams, we see him here, sentenced him to life. Raymond was transferred back to the east, to Marquette State Branch Prison, and here he was registered as prisoner number 37. And in this prison, Raymond would spend 25 years of his life. He was locked up in a small cell, and with that, the story could have been finished with Raymond being prisoner number 37. The delusions and spells Raymond had complained about at his trial, they continued. There were times when he went crazy, alternating with periods of stability in which he behaved normally. On Thursday, 6 March 1890, 3.5 months after Raymond was imprisoned in Marquette, his despair reached a sad low. He was suicidal, psychotic. He threatened a fellow prisoner with a knife and challenged the guards to shoot him. The result was a life-threatening situation that lasted for hours, both for himself and for a few others in prison. Eventually, the knife was shot out of his hand, which caused Raymond to losing 4 of his fingers. He was treated, locked up, and a very sad period followed. He wanted to die. He went on hunger strike, was eventually forced to eat, and finally, in the autumn of 1890, he was doing a little better. The prison director, who was interested in his case, asked Raymond to write down his life story, which was published in a newspaper some years later. And this is a remarkable document that Raymond produced, in which he explains in detail what his state of mind looked like during that period and what led him to his actions. He wrote, he read, but still, good and bad days alternated until he was losing grip again. And in the autumn of 1893, 3 years later, the prison director decided to have him treated at the Ionia Asylum for mentally ill prisoners, more than 400 miles to the south in Sneal Lansing. And unfortunately, the archive of the institute in Ionia was lost in the fire. We therefore do not know exactly what Raymond was treated for and how this treatment looked like. But newspapers at the time reported he had a surgery on his head. And the effect was wonderful. After his return to Marquette, Raymond's character changed into that of a model prisoner, and a new chapter in his life started. Slowly, and after a lot of pain and agony, his life would turn from bullets to books. Raymond probably took a course in photography in Ionia, because shortly after his return to Marquette Branch Prison, he became responsible for making the mugshots of all the new prisoners. This new technique must have intrigued him, and he got a chance to take more pictures than those of the inmates alone. He took pictures of the inside of the prison, and even of the outside of it, as you see here. And he started to make souvenirs like this paperweight, which he sold. He earned some money with it. All prisoners in Marquette had to work. He became a librarian, and he earned some money selling groceries. And he did more things. He started a prison paper for his fellow prisoners. The Progress, the newspaper was called. And in it he would write extensively about life in prison, but in a philosophical and sociological way, about the problems with which one was confronted when in detention. So after his treatment, he changed from a feared and notorious criminal into a model prisoner who was able to give a meaning to his life and who became an example to his fellow prisoners. He became respected by his fellow inmates and by the prison's staff. Again, he drew the attention of newspapermen. They were impressed by his transformation, but also by his intellectual capacities and his writings. In 1903, his good behavior led to attempts to regain his freedom. A journalist wrote in the Ironwood News, and I quote, "Very few people who are in any degree acquainted with Raymond will throw any obstacles in the way of his gaining the desired pardon. Opposition, such of it as may be encountered, will come from individuals who remember only the series of crimes of which Holzhey was guilty of, and who are unfamiliar with the change that he has undergone during his 14 years' incarceration in prison." Journalists, people from outside the prison walls, started to lobby for him. This did not lead to immediate success. Raymond had to be patient. Time after time, his pardon requests were rejected, but he kept persisting, and he kept on writing. In the prison paper, he wrote that crime was, in fact, foolishness. He wrote about misconduct, and I quote again, "Misconduct has a foolish aspect. While many have no fear in being thought of as bad, few, if any, desire to appear as fools in their own sight or in that of others. Great numbers of men, because of their mental limitations, can never be brought to a realization that wrongdoing is folly. Yet, it's a social ethical necessity that all men should entertain some idea that right is right and that wrong is wrong, because on the whole, the former pays and the latter does not. For those who hold the opposite view to any extent become cheats and crooks by sheer necessity of their mental bent. And it's this class of men that does the corrupt work in politics, lives by fraud and crime, and largely fills the penal institutions." To solve the problem of crime, Raymond thought it to be essential to make criminals realize clearly that self-interest is furthered by right doing and vice versa. But, as he wrote, "as all this requires a comparatively high-grade mind, capable of abstract reasoning and possessing considerable knowledge of psychic and psychological processes and the close mutual interdependence of the social units under the existing conditions of life, it quite naturally follows that but few prisoners, or for that matter even free men, can travel very far on this road." The big breakthrough for Raymond came in 1910. Instead of a life sentence, as Judge Williams had ruled in November 1889, Governor Warner decided, shortly before he retired on the 2nd of January 1911, to commute Raymond's sentence to 40 years in prison. In October 1912, the parole board met again, discussing Raymond's pardon request. Raymond was heard, and the verdict was clear. He would be released. The newspapers speculated on this, and already in the summer of 1912 there were speculations of Raymond to be released in the not-too-distant future. He was finally released on Monday, July the 7th, 1913. A day earlier, the news of his release had already attracted a number of reporters to prison, hoping for an interview or a statement from the prison administration. This was exactly what Warden James Russell didn't want to happen. If the gate would open the next morning, Raymond would be besieged by journalists. Photos would be taken of him, everyone would know what he looked like now, and he would immediately be a public figure again. And that was why a trick was invented. At night, at 12:02, on the day Raymond was to be released, a carriage drove into prison. Inside the gate, Raymond crawled under the seat, after which the coachman left, passing the waiting journalist in the directions of a safe house in Marquette, and there Raymond spent the night. As I have already indicated, Raymond had the support of a number of newspaper editors, but also of members of the Board of Parole and of this man. You see here John Munro Longyear. Longyear was a wealthy industrialist who had bought large areas of land at the Upper Peninsula and, together with other millionaires such as beer brewer Frederick Miller, industrialist Cyrus McCormick, and others, he had founded the Huron Mountain Club. And this really was a millionaires' club with about 20,000 acres of private land and no more than 50 members allowed. Ironically, Raymond, a man who had robbed well-to-do bankers and lawyers, now stayed here among the rich and famous for a year as a guide and a photographer. Besides, he hardly seems to have had a need to make any money himself. During his years in prison, he had saved money. Among other things, he had bought copper shares, with which he made nice profits. On his release, the newspapers wrote that he would probably never have to work again. In 1915, here in Front Street, Marquette, you see on the photo, he opened a photo shop under the name of Carl Paul, a shop he closed a few years later. Perhaps he was too well known as a former robber, or the anti-German mood in the First World War played a role. So he didn't succeed, but he returned to Longyear's Huron Mountain Club, where he lived as a guard and a guide until around 1930, still calling himself Carl Paul. People remembered him later, like Winston Ellen, an architect, who, as a boy, went into the woods with Raymond. He said about Raymond, "He had a mustache. His head was always too big and came down over his rather large ears. In the woods, he always carried an axe. He was, despite his right hand, very proficient with it. He loved the forest and got to know it well. He was a good paddler, but he could not row. He was a good cook. He could quote Shakespeare or Spengler by the hour. His humor was keen and his broken English picturesque. He talked of wolves and swamps, and his laugh was always hee hee hee. He smoked a corn pipe. No reference to his former life was ever made to him or by him. He loved to tell stories from the books he had read, and we would sit around the fire at night listening to him." It were trips into the wilderness like these Raymond used to guide, until around 1930, the time when he turned 65. At some point, we don't know exactly when, he started spending his winters in Florida, here on Captiva Island. He got older. Maybe the winters in Michigan were too cold for him, but the way he got to Captiva Island is uncertain. There are two possibilities for connections between the Huron Mountain Club and Captiva, which we still have to explore a little bit further. The first opportunity is maybe the man we see here on the slide in the background, Henry Ford, the man with the hat. That's him. Henry Ford had joined the Huron Mountain Club in 1925 as one of the only 15 members of the Huron Mountain Club. Raymond, as a guide, must have known this and probably has guided him. Already by 1916, as a good friend of Thomas Edison, Henry Ford had built a house in Fort Myers. In 1928, the Edison Botanical Research Laboratory was founded, and we wonder, can it be that Henry Ford was the connection and the reason for Raymond to come to Florida? We don't know. Or was it the Snyder School for Boys here on Captiva Island? Clarence E Snyder organized summer and winter schools for boys in different places in the United States. He had a school in Michigan, in the Urim Mountain Club, and it's likely that Raymond was involved as a guide for pupils at the Urim Mountain Club. This was around 1914. Around this time, Snyder also built a school on Captiva. Fact is that in later years Holzhey wintered in Florida, and in 1934 he made the islands of Sanibel and Captiva his permanent home. He purchased property on Captiva Island in a subdivision called Bayview, and he purchased land from Clara Strand on November the 17th, 1934. The Chadwicks were developers here and owned large tracts of Captiva at the time. Ina Watson, a resident of Captiva, had recalled meeting Holzhey while her family was camping on the island. One night, he happened to steal into our camp area. He was an old man as far as I was concerned. I was young at that time. He was ancient as far as I was concerned. He came down to the camp and we talked. So he came down every night to keep us company. We didn't know where he lived. We didn't ask him. He questioned me on the history of Germany. Raymond built a small house which he offered to the Watsons, and Mrs. Watson bought it. The house was, as it's called, that little shell shop where they have the ramp going up. It's still there. At the moment, it's to the right of the post office. His own house stood next to it and is known from this remarkable photograph in the Island Reporter of 1982. According to the newspaper article, Fort Myers News Press on his death, we saw at the beginning, Raymond was still writing. He is said to have been working as a freelance journalist, writing human interest pieces for the Sunday papers and for several nearby dailies. A neighbor, Mrs. Clara Strand, we see her here, took care of him. She brought him his morning and evening meals. She reported that he refused to see a doctor. And shortly before his death, Raymond bought a gun and finally killed himself on his porch after a long and incredible life of which the last decades seem to have been peaceful and calm. On Captiva he found his place forever. On September the 27th, 1952, he was cremated. His ashes were scattered at Redfish Pass, just at the northern tip of the island. Clara Strand took care of his estate, and that was that. But what is still interesting is that Raymond is always remembered as the dangerous robber, the criminal who made the north of the US unsafe, robbed and shot someone. Portrayed as a dangerous outlaw, the Jesse James of the North, here on a staged photo. Raymond was provided with a vest with cartridges and a rifle, not his own, to make this photo, which seems to have been directly inspired by the famous picture of Billy the Kid. This image of the dangerous Robert Raymond Halsey comes back again and again. His second life, after his operation, is much less well known and has received less attention, but we are convinced that this part is at least as interesting because it shows how someone who gets a second chance in life can still make something of it. This does not alter the fact that Raymond was responsible for the horrible death of Dolph Flashbang, but it does show that evil was not a fixed part of his character. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.